we may have left the least for last, but I'll do what I can to maintain the interesting presentations. So I want to talk a bit about housing systems as a sort of conceptual device for thinking about how we do housing policy analysis, and also about policy mobilities, but use those as devices to talk about this exciting new venture that we're undertaking, the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, which will filter through everything I say. So first of all, what is CASH? CASH is our acronym for the Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. In our research council's kind of target, we are partly a what works centre, so we're looking at evaluating the effectiveness of housing policy practice interventions. We're a kind of a network plus entity. In other words, we're involved in a lot of relationship building across the housing policy practice and academic communities. We're also doing primary research. We are a consortium, or a collaboration of 13 different institutions, 3 of which are non-academic. And we are, apart from trying to build rigorous evidence about housing in Britain and housing policy, we're also trying to rebuild some of the lost capacity that's happened in terms of the size of the cohort of housing scholars in the UK. So we're funding 10 PhDs. We're going to have at least 9 additional researchers. We have 4 early career researcher co-investigators. We're running summer schools. We're doing a whole lot of things to try to rebuild the housing academic community in the UK. We think we're distinctive in a number of respects. We're multidisciplinary. We are committed to being multidisciplinary. That also means we use plural and quite different sets of research methods in our work. So a big challenge for everything we do is to be coherent, to be able to communicate with each other as well as the wider world, and to think about transparent ways we can identify the different ways we're doing the kind of work we're doing. We're also fundamentally about knowledge exchange, so we have 5 knowledge exchange staff across the UK, 3 of whom are full-time for 5 years, conducting a whole range of the interface between our work and the communities we want to reach. We also have a responsive mode, so we are actively seeking further research and further partnership opportunities, further additional funding, and we try to combine, as I'll show in a second, overarching themes and geographies which encompass all of the UK, but draw from international research evidence in the things that we're going to try and do. So these, on the left-hand side, are our 5 knowledge exchange hubs, each of which represent in a kind of a general way the shape of the housing system in each part of the country in a consistent kind of way. And our advisory board represents the UK version of that, or international version of that. The honeycomb thing in the middle are our 7 themes. We started off with 6 themes, which was what the ESRC's call specification gave us: the economy, the housing market, choice, aspirations, how housing as a system relates to other complex systems like health and education, multi-level governance, a set of themes around place to do with planning, neighbourhoods and placemaking, and since then we've added homelessness as a discrete theme as well. So I said earlier that we're trying to take systems seriously, and by that I mean the idea that housing policies need to accurately reflect the complexity of how housing actually functions as a set of interdependent, connected things with emergent properties, feedback loops, and a whole range of things going on at different scales within that system. And what we're really seeing, again, it's a tricky thing because we have to try and have a common usage of thinking about housing systems across our different disciplines. But what we're trying to say is that we need to reflect on those systematic, system-type issues on a consistent basis if we're going to inform policy in a sufficiently rigorous and serious way. And that's also a pretty major challenge. And these are some of the aspects of that system-wide analysis. So the kind of way, at a very simplistic, crude level, one might think about this is to think of the drivers of the housing system, the more exogenous, external factors which impact on the housing system itself, which might be a place, might be a metropolitan housing area, but it might be something different, might be a national system. that there'll be some kind of institutional regulatory forces at work there, as well as the kind of things we think of as constituting those elements or nodes of a housing system, and that we then measure them in some kinds of outcomes. Some signals would be generated out of that system, and they would feed back into the rest of the system. And what's become increasingly apparent since at least the late 1980s, but more so since 2007, is that the housing system itself impacts significantly on the economy itself, and is actually a driver of the economy too, amongst other things. So, the second thing I wanted to touch briefly on is comparative housing research, policy mobilities, policy transfer, things of that kind. And that reflects two other projects I've been involved in recently before Cash came about. One is something called the European Housing Partnership, which was about a kind of European-wide review of barriers and opportunities for affordable housing. And secondly, a knowledge exchange programme that I worked on with my colleague Duncan McLennan in Glasgow about effectively redesigning housing policies, looking comparatively at Canada, Australia and the UK. And we had a sort of subscription model where practitioner organisations bought in to participate in the process, and it was a very useful experience. And thirdly, within Cash, I should have said earlier that we have 12 exemplar pilot projects that we're doing in the first year of the programme, which were part of our bid a year previously. And one of them is about reflecting on housing policy transfer. Why housing studies doesn't make that much use of some of the wider policy science literature on policy transfer and mobilities. And in particular, why in the UK is that the case, and what can be done about it? What lesson learning takes place, what sharing things takes place? What can we say about convergence and divergence? So, just to reflect on that a little bit more, our European Housing Partnership work suggested that in a context of rising needs across Europe, there's diverse but increasing vulnerability to economic and financial shocks impacting on housing systems. Secondly, that most, but not all, European countries are operating in an austere public finance context, and that makes thinking about policy making all the more critical, i.e. not wasting resources with ineffectual or counterproductive housing policies. And indeed, as one of the earlier speakers said, things like prevention are really important in that context. And it also seemed, drawing out the findings that we had in talking to a number of people and doing some case studies across Europe, that it's also important that in that context, that policies actually take as it were, a more humble sense of what they can and cannot do, and that they are at least cognizant of the different ways in which there can be these knock-on feedback effects through the operation of markets, particularly the labour market. And indeed, in addition to that, apart from the old debates about what we actually mean by affordability and what it operationally is about, it's clearly not just about housing. Housing is a kind of site of affordability problem, and is partly, yes, it's partly an issue about housing costs, but clearly it's also an issue about the precarious nature of work and about incomes and about a whole range of other issues, including transport. The Shaping Futures programme starts off with this premise that my colleague Duncan McLennan often uses, which is to think of housing as essential economic infrastructure within urban and metropolitan systems, and that's particularly evident in some of the hotter housing systems that we looked at in Vancouver, in Melbourne, Sydney and London, etc. And the work that I was involved in was much more to the last two bullet points. First of all, about finance, the kind of message that come across is that there aren't really new, genuinely innovative ideas about how you might use finance to generate more affordable housing. When you scratch the surface, they're all familiar ideas. They all relate to the same fundamental, irreducible ideas. The issue is really about politics, and it's about the extent to which, for whatever reason, there's what political scientists would call an Overton window, and there's an opportunity to spend money and increase resources into the housing sphere rather than not, whether that's sustainable or not. And of course that depends on history and path dependency and such like. Well, the other area that we found was particularly interesting is we had a lot of housing regulators and housing institutional people sitting around our meetings, and it's quite clear that governance and good governance is a necessary condition of good housing policy, but it's not sufficient one. Sometimes the policy deficit, as it were, has got nothing to do with governance and regulation, but sometimes undoubtedly it does. So to give you one kind of example of that very briefly, the Australian model is a housing system which works really without a community-based or a housing association type model. It's often been argued that they need to get a regulatory model somewhat similar to what happens in England and Scotland if they have to achieve that. And our conclusion from our work with Australian academics and practitioners was that it would be exactly that, a necessary condition but not sufficient of itself. You still need the resource and the kind of leadership to make the sector develop. The other area of cross-national analysis that we found really interesting is within the UK, and that's about the extent. I've been talking in a sense about convergence of many dimensions of European housing policy and practice. Well, the interesting thing, of course, in the UK is the apparent and rapidly accelerating divergence of housing policy if you compare parts of the devolved nation's experience and the opportunities that might exist in the city regions and the likes of New York kind of space as well. So it seems that in a sense there's housing policy which is largely devolved but has also got some reserve elements to it as well. That there's an interesting set of opportunities for natural experiments and other forms of process going on. Actually phased out from 2007 onwards. One of the consequences of that, alongside a much more generous per capita public spending in social housing, is that we're now building council housing on quite a large scale in Scotland. We have a fairly significant housing, affordable social housing supply target over the life of this Parliament. And indeed, in Scotland, over the next 2 or 3 years, the absolute size of the social sector is going to increase for the first time since the 1980s, which is quite obviously radically different from what's happening in England. Secondly, in the private rented sector, we've introduced new tenancy law which came into force in December, which effectively creates a form of open-ended tenancy for all new private tenancies. So not the 6-month or very short fixed tenancies apparent in the rest of the UK, but tenancies where the government hopes that families will want to live in the private rented sector, and that will be part of the force to increase the quality of the sector. They've also introduced or given the possibility of quite light touch rent controls as well, although they will actually in practice be quite challenging to introduce. That's again a very different setting from elsewhere. So the question my colleague Alex Marsh and I are asking in this project is, why isn't there more lesson sharing? Because there's an incredibly superficial set of interests, it seems, about these different policies that are taking place in the UK. There is some policy infrastructure. The 4 federations of housing associations talk to each other twice a year, do work together. We have a thing called the British and Isles Council, which is a civil servant body for actually sharing policy ideas and practice. We're trying to find out what that actually looks like underneath. So my final slide is really just to return to the themes of the conference, just some random thoughts, really, I suppose. Clearly, much of the housing challenge is itself an urban or a suburban challenge. That's where it's situated. It has a massive impact on urban systems. There's clearly a symbiotic or sometimes dysfunctional relationship. One example, housing is, in the UK, essentially the key site of holding personal wealth, transferring personal wealth, and transferring inequality, as it were. So it plays a really major role in how that happens through generations. It's perhaps something that holds back all sorts of economic productivity in urban systems. As Duncan's point of essential economic infrastructure, we're frequently told by businesses that we need better local housing systems to facilitate business. It's not simply a kind of the usual suspects queuing up for more affordable housing. The thing I've not talked about today is I've been involved in a project with colleagues at the University of Reading about persistence and history in housing economies, and the fact that intra-urban scales, there's lots of evidence of the persistence of poverty across space, of relative property values across space over 90, 100, 150 years in places like London and Glasgow and Melbourne and other places that we've looked at. It's not always as straightforward as that, but there are remarkable degrees of persistence which are economically quite robust. I read from the work we've done in Europe and shaping futures, that policy mobility is incredibly important, but we should do it very cautiously. All of these institutional differences that we're very well aware of, path dependencies that exist, mean that we should be cautious, but we should always talk about different places that do different novel things and see how we can customise them. Cash has just finally got its first proper website up and running, and to launch it we've put a briefing paper in about Brexit and housing, which in a sense captures some of these both European things, but also the way that the housing system is embedded in the broader economy in so many ways. But I'll finish with where I kind of started, which is that everything that we're going to try and do in cash is about the rigorous application of evidence, and I think that equally applies to the themes